when I first thought about this, it was literally 2 weeks after Louk died. I was in Australia and couldn't go to Louk's funeral. And the last thing we talked about before I went to Australia with Louk and I was that he might come to Belfast that summer to be with us in Belfast. And they were our kind of last words together. Louk was an inspiration to me. He was a friend. He was a comrade. He was somebody who stood by everybody. Louk was indefinable. In terms of the way in which he lived his life, it was remarkable. He was one of those people who lived his life exactly as you would have expected him to live it, given the views and the ideas you heard him talk of and that you heard him, you read when he wrote. Louk was also somebody who, if he was standing here now, probably wouldn't let you out of here until about 5 o'clock tonight. And all the other things that we had scheduled would all be thrown out of the window. And people would be making signs and so on, and all he would do is simply wave back, you know, and carry on as he was before with his piece of chalk and a board. And the one thing you never were with Louk was bored. He was an incredible person, an incredible inspiration. And it was a great honour to write for the journal on prison, by prisoners on prisons, to write for the journal a dedication to him last year. And some of that article that I wrote in that dedication formed the basis of this, and then there's more that I've added to it. Well, at the last ICOPA conference, Thomas Mathieson, who would be somebody else within the abolitionist movement that we would all have a tremendous admiration and deep love for, was making the comment about not feeling desperate or ashamed that we had stopped this whole wave towards increased punitive populism, the panics, the rising prison figures, all of those issues that have become increasingly more apparent as we've gone through the years, even in the Scandinavian societies. But one of the things he said that really resonated was that abolitionism is a stance. It's an attitude of saying no, he said. And of course, he's arguing here that it's about a stance that is not only important, but is constant and deeply critical attitude towards prisons and penal systems as human and inhumane solutions. And the important issue he was making is that it goes beyond the parameters of conditions of existing systems, which is a point, of course, that was right at the heart of Louk's work. Now, sadly, Rebecca isn't here today. She had to get a flight back to her work last night. But some of you will have heard Rebecca Roberts speak yesterday. And with her permission, I'm using these quotes from the last interview with Louk that took place in London. There have been other interviews by other people, but this was the last that was taken by people working with him in London, and it was from Rebecca's work. In learning about criminal justice, I learned about the police and knew about the legislation, and I learned about the prison. I'd been in prison because I'd been arrested in the war and been in a concentration camp, had all those experiences. I don't know how to organise all that knowledge. I couldn't do something with all that knowledge in those frameworks. Then he says he read Thomas's defining work, The Politics of Abolition. He says, I thought, I have to reorganise now all my knowledge about it. You cannot, in that language of criminal justice, you cannot discuss criminal justice in the language of criminal justice. That was the moment of abolition. That was the moment that confronted him. I have to do what he is saying there. It was a real awakening. And of course, I would say and argue that Thomas Mathieson's book had the same impact on me, but so also did Louk. In one of his papers in 1986, Louk talks about criminal events and the whole way in which we conceptualize criminal events as being seen as exceptional, something that is beyond the norm, something that is outside of us, that criminal conduct becomes the most important cause of deviance and criminal behaviour, and that criminals thereby, rather than being all of us who breach or break laws at some time, criminals are then given that label of a special category of people. That is the process, I would argue, of criminalisation. And Niels Christie, who is also a colleague of Louk's and a strong, close friend of Louk's, as with Thomas, and a good friend of ours in the European group, Niels makes that very important point that is obvious to anybody doing critical analysis. Acts are not, they become. They're what we make of them, basically. So it is, he says, with crime. Crime does not exist. Crime is created. First there are acts, then follows that long process of giving meaning to those acts. And that whole construction of crime, the whole process of criminalisation that is attendant to it, becomes part of that crucial connection between how we see crime and punishment. Louk, in another one of his papers, argued very strongly that with this conceptualization, with this moment of abolition, we have to challenge the whole criminal justice system, and we heard some of that yesterday. The typical products of the system are the infliction of suffering and stigmatization. I think that can't be underestimated. You know, we called it the violence of incarceration because we named it as it is, that incarceration is always violent. Even if it's passively violent, it is always violent. Nobody is incarcerated out of free will and choice. Yet, he says, those involved in criminal events do not in themselves to form a special category of people. Nothing distinguishes these criminal events intrinsically from other difficult or unpleasant situations that we live in part of everyday life that aren't necessarily categorized as crime or as deviance. Considerable proportion of the events, which could be defined as serious crime within the context of the criminal justice system, remain completely outside that system. And we don't need to go through the whole process. There's been a whole new industry within crime of the conceptualization of harm, which I still have problems with, the conceptualization of harm, which actually is arguing that very clear point. So, you know, the deaths in Iraq, the deaths in Afghanistan, deaths from pollution, all of those issues, they're all harms, but they're not necessarily criminal. We might see them with that definition, but they're not. They bear the legitimacy of the state and the state institutional definition. So, if we are affirming a critical analysis, what are we looking to process? A criminology which continues to incorporate into its language the concepts which play a key role in the criminal justice process can never take on an external view on this reality and is therefore unable to demystify it, says Louk. For criminology to be critical, it must abandon the definitional activities of the system, including the notion of crime, which is not the object, but actually the product of criminal policy. And I think that makes the connection with Niels Christie's comment perfectly well in terms of how the meaning of the act is in the definition. But of course, these are powerful definitions. These come from, to use Howard Becker's phrase, from powerful definers. They're not us defining in that kind of postmodernist relativist state where everything could be crime and everything could be not crime. You know, I mean, it's actually and that depends on the individual. It depends on the relativity of the group. No, this is about powerful definers who use their power in that construction. So the connection of criminalization to myself, in my own work, in that, you know, years back now with Catherine Chadwick, for example, would actually just see that criminalization as a process in the same way as the criminal justice system is a process that connects crime to criminal justice, to punishment, and then to professionals who can't think outside of those connections. Louk was also very strong in the argument about seeking alternatives. You know, it's one thing to break down a system and a structure, but what is the equivalent? What is going to take its place? And he, of course, argues that to offer a conceptual, it's another one of his papers, a conceptual system to contextualize the ideas on alternatives to criminal justice and the concrete projects developed in many countries which are founded on such ideas. To make progress in the field of alternatives, he says, we have to abandon the cultural and social organization of criminal justice. Criminal justice is perpetrator-oriented. I sat the other day in an Institute of Criminology meeting with state agents, the heads of all the services here in the north of Ireland, and we sat around that table And all they could talk about was victims, victims, victims. And when I raised the point about the perpetrator as victim, they couldn't understand even remotely what I was talking about. Criminal justice, and I was doing that not because I want to get into the language of perpetrator and victim, but just to show them how shallow and hollow that conceptualization is. Criminal justice is perpetrator-oriented, based on blame allocation, on last judgment view of the world. It therefore does not provide us with information and a context in which, in an emancipatory way, problematic situations can be defined and dealt with. And in this comment about critical criminology, coming at the point of time when most people in other European states and in the US and the US and Latin America and Asia and down to Australia didn't know what on earth was going on in left-wing criminology in the UK, we went through that whole process of left realism versus left idealism. And it was halfway through that debate, when very few people criticised me as a left idealist. I was pretty disappointed, actually. It was in the middle of all of that debate when I said, yeah, I'll take the mantle. I am an idealist. If by what you mean is I have an ideal about the world in which I live in, I'm proud to be named an idealist. But of course it was seen pejoratively by those left realists as they self-defined themselves and marginalised the rest of us. But critical criminology really got its cutting edge out of that debate, I believe, in these islands. And it's that whole argument that goes right back to the analysis that Louk had been developing within the European group and with our comrades in that group about abandoning this behaviour deviance as a starting point for analysis and adopting a situation-oriented approach, micro and macro. And of course, that can be put even more simply and straightforwardly than that. Context. Contextualization. How, in specific field problematic situations, could be addressed at different levels of societal organization without having recourse to criminal justice. How to abolish criminal justice, those strategies, they contribute to the development of another overall language in which questions related to criminal justice and to public problems which generate claims to criminalization can be discussed without bias of the present control babble. And I just thought that was such a Louk phrase, you know, control babble, all this sort of babbling that was going on that had absolutely no coherence other than appealing to the worst levels of people's reactionary politics.